It's time to experience true pain in E4M10 Massive Chasm. I think this is a first for me, a Wolf 3D map that I genuinely despise. I don't know if the idea is to gun through or try to stealth, but neither of them proved fun in the slightest. The only viable thing for me was running straight for the exit, ignoring most of the treasure. It's so packed full of officers that just about nothing else is viable, even holding up in the exit. If you ask me, this is a secret map you can not only skip, but I'd easily recommend you do. It's time to meet the rest of the family in E6M10 Gross of Baddies. I'll be honest, this is my second least favorite secret map behind Massive Chasm, not only reintroducing those loathsome mutants, but throwing in 3 grosses. What, are the Pazis cloning them or something? You only technically have to take on one of them to get to the exit, but it still seems excessive. That part wouldn't even be so bad if you weren't pretty ground down before getting to them with little to no opportunities to restock outside of the gross rooms themselves. The secret Pac-Man ghost is cute and the vines are a nice touch, but it doesn't save this map from being pretty skippable. It's time to succumb to the insanity in E6M8 Mind Madness! As the penultimate map of the original Wolfenstein 3D, I have to say, this is very much a letdown with straight lines full of enemies. I know I criticized previous maps for having mobs of enemies, but this more than any other feels like it was just designed around that. The only branching path is a locked door. Unless you're hunting for secrets, you're just not going to find anything approaching actual exploration, and the mobs of hit scanners have run their course by now. The best I can say about this map is it isn't the worst, but it's a far cry from anything like the Living End. It's time to get smurfed in the Smurf in E5M7 Smurfing Jailhouse. It's pretty much just a gauntlet map the whole way through, relying on overwhelming numbers of enemies even from the start. The only other thing of note is a secret push wall that can sneak a key if you push it from the right side, but becomes caught from the other one. Other than that, it seems like the map really doesn't have anything that special going for it, other than just proving an extra challenge. I get the appeal, it certainly never got frustrating for me, but I like maps that have something going for them other than just Zerg rushing you the whole time. It's time for Rapture Nightmares in E5M9 Big Sis. If you expect Gretel to be anything more than a carbon copy of her brother, prepare for disappointment. Officers and Super Smurfs lead to more of a challenge than the original Gross, but the fight itself is just as disappointing. The only thing of note is the weird mix of flags, world maps, and desks that Blazkowicz is apparently super excited to see at the end of the map. Even if they couldn't really distinguish Gretel by much, they could have at least made the map itself more interesting so it isn't over so disappointingly fast. It's time to tame our deepest frights in E6M9 Fearsome Fettgesicht. Welp, it's the final map alright because it's really pulling out of the stops in terms of feeling cheap with the absolute flood of enemies. If you're wondering why I have a problem with this, it's because Wolfenstein 3D both uses almost exclusively hit-scan enemies and they fire through each other. Also doesn't help that both sides flood you when you make any noise. The map gives you 3 secrets full of health and ammo and you'll need them. The general himself is basically just Otto mixed with Gross, very easy compared to his men, so overall it's a disappointing finale if I'm honest. It's time to get down in more ways than one in E4M5 Underground Rave. This one's overall alright with a few unique deviations from previous maps like the return of dogs. It also fakes you out with a few fake exits, including the expected cheeky room full of enemies. The one thing I really wasn't a fan of was a mandatory secret to get a key. Apparently the chain gun was supposed to entice you, but if you already had one, it's less tempting. Overall though, it's at least a pretty decent map with a good sense of exploration. It's time to headbutt some rocks in E6M1 Concrete Confrontation. This might just have the second most annoying mechanic I've seen in the Nocturnal missions hallways with nukes hiding officers to grind you to a halt. It isn't so much difficult as it's just a slog to get through, and while it is relatively unique, that doesn't mean it's necessarily good. The map at least follows the trend of just giving you a chain gun in the first map via a secret, so that's cool, and it has the concept of a locked door secret which Doom would use. Ultimately though, the map bases itself too tightly around winding halls and those nukes are too annoying for comfort. It's time to buckle up, Goron Cowboy, for E6M5 Rocky Rodeo. At the risk of repeating myself, it's another map that seems to just rely heavily on a flood of enemies and being very linear. The closest it gets to being genuinely original is near the end. The nukes are in a larger room, though I'd still suggest inching forward. Even the enemies in the lift exit has been done before, having 3 of them doesn't make it super original. Admittedly, the Wolf 3D limitations make it difficult to have such genuine variants, but I feel like there could have been more than this. It just feels like more filler, which this far in is perhaps not the most surprising. It's time to have more fun than a barrel of Pazis, E5M2. The main gimmick of this map is basically a hall of super smurfs behind barrels that shoot at you if you enter, a literal death trap. The map is nice enough to give you a chain gun if you didn't find the prior secret, and a nearby secret gives you a lot of health and ammo if you want to take them on. The rest of the map is honestly nothing special though, just some officers, smurfs, and troops about with a key to reach the exit. Still not a terrible map, but that gauntlet of smurfs is the only thing noteworthy, and you sadly can't even access their ammo after killing them. It's time to coil around and squeeze hard in E6M2 Super Snaking. Well, if you enjoyed the enemies hitting and nukes mechanic from the previous map, then do I have good news for you! The one upside is at least it's easier for you to run past it to trigger them all at once rather than one at a time, but then it's just long winding halls to the exit. No real opportunities for non-linear, it's pretty much a straight line the whole way through for the most part, with the one major deviation being to get a key. Really though, this map has to be the literal definition of filler. It's completely unremarkable in any possible way. It's time to get recolored backsides and E6M4 tanned hides. For the most part, it's another pretty typical go in straight line paths and take down gauntlets of enemies like super smurfs and officers. While a couple branching paths do present themselves and a couple of hidden chain guns if you don't have one, it's mostly what you've come to expect. There really isn't anything all that noteworthy to the design except maybe some decoration here and there and an interesting tan-colored wall. Ultimately, it's a map that neither offends nor particularly impresses. It's another piece of filler on your way through Wolf 3D as a whole. It's time to fall right into E5M6 Super Spelunking. This map has an interesting design. It's effectively a stone base surrounded by cavernous rock with a red brick one jutting out of it. Other than being somewhat visually unique, I can't say the map really has all too much going for it for being where it is. It makes pretty good use of the cramped base space, but it feels a bit short-lived even by Wolfenstein 3D standards, and the officer ambushes are becoming predictable. It's still a good map, all things considered, but it feels as though there could be more to it, but at least it doesn't actively irritate me. It's time to salute the boom in E4M9 Automatic Obliteration. At first glance, this is just a typical boss map like with Gross from the first episode. However, Otto has the unique wrinkle of a projectile rocket launcher, pretty tough on the MS-DOS original. Showcasing the kind of trickiness this episode seems to love, there's also a trap with the keys. If you want to heal and get more ammo, you need those keys, but one misfire and you've got a horde on you. Ultimately, it's still a pretty shallow boss map, but the tricks up its sleeve elevated above grass at least. It's time to run like crazy in E5M1 Madman's Chase. This is certainly a very sucker-punchy map, putting a super smurf among 2 troops just past the start. At least you get a machine gun fairly fast then, but then you've got a long haul of enemies. The room leading into the exit actually annoyed me. It has crevices hiding enemies. My only hope really was backing off right away since they'll sandwich you otherwise, but at least the map has a hidden chain gun like the previous episode's starter map. I'm pretty sure I was just being salty, and it's still good for map design, so I'm willing to be lenient on it overall. It's time to go spelunking and gunning in E4M1 Cavernous Combat. This map is a little tough for a starter map, but nothing too grating with mostly officers and super smurfs to worry about. At least the latter means you'll probably get a machine gun pretty quickly to better defend yourself with, a godsend because pistol no very good. You can even get a chain gun if you find the right secret, which is funny to think about getting it this early into an episode. I find it kinda funny that the rock texture would later be reused for Doom. It's time to resume basic functions in E6M3 Base number 1945. This one is fine, but Robert must have been feeling cheeky when he made it because the map's basically 7 of, let's call it the symbol of the Pazis. While that's thematically appropriate, it does lead to most of the map feeling very samey, hence my generic sounding name for it. Not too much to say apart from that, although interestingly enough there are brown and green barrels to guide you to the key or exit. There's also a diagonal section to a pillar looking at the exit, which reminds me of Nightmare 3D, funnily enough. Ultimately, it's an alright map, but still not anything especially earth-shattering, just some cheeky shapes. It's time for a battle of the bricks in E5M3 Red vs. Gray. This one is a lot more simple than some previous maps, no gimmicks, but some nicely large areas and more than one way to get into a lot of areas. Officers and Super Smurfs still provide a decent amount of challenge, but the machine gun, let alone the chain gun, should make dealing with them easy enough. There's not really a lot to say about this map to be honest, but that's not a bad thing either. While I'd have liked it to be a bit longer, at least it doesn't overstay its welcome or annoy you with some cheap shot. It's nice and serviceable. It's time to get stuck between a Reich and a hard place, an E6M3. So I like the map design quite a bit, but maybe not so much the enemy placement because it feels a little cheap. Getting the first key is literally just a mob of enemies, and it seems like it's way too easy to get surrounded by hit scanners, which doesn't feel engaging. To the map's credit, it's relatively non-linear, even if the map is relatively on the small side, or at least it feels like it is. It's hard to place this because the map made me furious when I was playing it, but I have to concede it has the kind of design I really like, so I'll say it's good overall. It's time for a Vampire's Delight, an E5M5 Bloodstained. This is another solid map with some good amount of exploration from the beginning and seems to favor swarming you from sides with enemies. This is best seen with a wooden trap room where there's 6 different doors for enemies to pour out of the room into to get behind you for a cheap flank. I'm not saying that to complain though, it just means you can't assume they'll always just be in front of you. It keeps you on your toes. It doesn't have the most exciting stuff to offer, but it's solid for a short-lived map and has a very generous amount of stuff for its secret exit too. It's time to pan in the river in E5M10 Golden Mile. This may be the most bonus map feeling of any secret map I've played in an FPS, which can be a good or a bad thing. It's mostly long snaking corridors with some enemies sprinkled in and treasure everywhere, especially generously so in the exit. It's almost like the angel to massive Chasm's devil, being a little too generous to the point that the map isn't anything too special, but it's not mindless either. If I was judging it as a normal map, I'd say it's not too special, but as an optional secret map, it's a nice breather map that encourages you to seek it out. It's time to don your face masks and cleaning rags in E6M7 Putrid Infestation. This is basically a massive maze split into one of cavern rock and one with that delightful purple ooze. The beginning wasn't my favorite. It started out with mobs including 4 pillared corners with officers, which came across as annoying and corner peeking. However, once you get past that hurdle, the actual mazes were much more interesting and you could even find your way into those 4 corners to plunder their goods. It has a mandatory secret, but at least it's right next to it, so it's not too hard to find. Good map, but just a disagreeable beginning. It's time to feel the secret blues in E4M6 Sapphire Mysteries. The beginning of the map is a bit like Bunker Blues, a ring of blue brick with some doors. These are in one long hallway and mostly one room, a bit reminiscent of Tricks and Traps. The latter half isn't nearly as interesting, a bit of a gauntlet to get the second key mostly. Troops, Super Smurfs, and officers are at least all put to good use here in a blended challenge. Ultimately, it's an alright map with a much more interesting beginning than end, but never really gets bad. It's time for Hurtin' Words in E4M2 Sticks and Stones. It's amazing, it has an officer map similar to the secret map, but this one's far better. Not every officer is alerted at once, and you have an entry point to fall back on. The rest of the map is relatively okay, not the lengthiest, but the multiple doors on top of each other is pretty cool, reminds me of Tricks and Traps from Doom 2. Officers still manage to catch me off guard, but it's nothing I can't handle. It feels a bit on the cramped side, but at least that gives it a unique flavor along with a more wood-walled aesthetic. Overall, it gets the job done and at least it feels different rather than a copy-paste job. It's time to howl at the walls in E5M4 Doggone Bricked. I know Wolf 3D can only offer up so much variation, but this sort of feels like they copy-pasted sectors. Just about everything is mirrored. Even the 2 secrets are mirrored onto opposite ends, making it sort of feel like the map was rushed out. The actual gameplay is fine, there's just enough enemies in each area that it's more than manageable with previous weaponry to get through. It's non-linear, feels very fair in its amount of enemies, and doesn't really overstay its welcome. Perhaps its unoriginality can be forgiven because it's just fine to blast through and I have no issues on that front. It's time for a fresh coat of paint in E5M8 Fresco Reich. It's kind of funny, this has something I see plenty in a Wolf 3D clone, Nightmare 3D, but not so much in Wolf 3D itself, obstacles to get a peek farther ahead. The use of barrels to see the exit path and a plant to see around a winding corner may not seem much, but it's a nice touch. There isn't too much to say about the map other than a healthy use of stained glass and that unique blue skull decor walls to at least distinguish from imprisoned blue stone. Ultimately, Wolf 3D has more or less played its hand already, but it's nice to see visual elements used in a different way to at least make it more memorable. It's time to feel down in the underground in E4M2 Bunker Blues. Despite the very clever name I gave it, I'm not feeling any blues about this map. It starts with an outer ring which grants some non-linearity and room for exploration. Decent amount of difficulty too, with officers and super smurfs roaming everywhere. Interestingly, there's also a series of push walls you have to push in a certain sequence like Aardwolf. Overall, it's not the best map in the world, but it's challenging and encourages exploration, so that's a win in my book. It's time to break out the soap in E4M8 Oozy Salute. As the penultimate map of the episode, it certainly isn't afraid to pull out tricks from the start. If the trap at the start wasn't enough, it ends up in a similar officer's maze as Sticks and Stones. It also makes more use of the different wall textures so it has distinct flavors for its rooms. Fittingly, there's a mob of enemies waiting between you and the final exit to the map. Overall, it's a map that really skill-checked me hard on Death Incarnate, death around every corner. It's time to face Stacked Heat in E4M3 Brick and Mortar Fire. This is another pretty good map with a decent amount of exploration. Even one optional area that can get fairly tough with a lot of enemies among pillars. It also happens to be where the secret exit is, and it's not too hard to find if you look around. You definitely don't want to play the episodes chronologically because it feels like an extension of the third. It continues the trend of being a little tough with officers and also nicely opened and tightly designed. It's time to watch your head in E4M7 Bricked Bunkin. This map focuses more on being a tight maze, the bricks making it feel like an old Windows screensaver. However, as I've said before, I kind of think this works to Wolf 3D's advantage since it just feels tighter. That's not to say it doesn't have large areas in there, but it's not the focus and I think it overall works well. It's pretty easy to get ambushed, but that just means it stays pretty difficult, which isn't a bad thing. Overall, I'd say it's a good tight map that has plenty of rooms to look around. It's time to overview these nighttime nocturnal missions. I'm conflicted. These missions have a lot of ups and downs for me, ranging from genuinely good to among the worst in my opinion. Its better maps are where they encourage exploration and are reasonably non-linear, and I do like introducing actual projectile enemies. However, far too often the later maps rely on spamming you with hit scan enemies and it feels cheap due to the game's mechanics. Just giving the general both weapons isn't that creative either, and Greta was just straight up a clone of Hans Gross. Overall, it has some good things, but I'd say it overall falls short of the original 3 missions.